You can talk about React as well.
Oh yeah, I got a whole slide dedicated to React.
Yeah, there's plenty of.
We're good? Okay.
Is front row still available?
There's plenty of seating up here.
Yeah, there's plenty of.
Front row is available. There's 4 there, 2 here. All right, everyone, welcome to my little presentation on Angular 2. As you all know, it released not too long ago. It's a pretty exciting development. It's been a long time in the works, and it has some pretty dramatic changes over Angular 1. And so I wanted to talk a little bit today about Angular 2, why we need to switch. I know a little earlier this month there was a presentation on getting the Angular 2 basic 1 up and going, so I'm not going to cover the basics of getting Angular 2 running. I'm more interested in migration path, convincing. Okay, thanks, Cody. Apologize if you can't hear me in the back. I'm going to speak louder now because Cody fixed me.
Cody is old, you can't hear very well. But.
Okay, good. Just let me know if you can't hear me. Raise your hand and I will answer your question and speak louder. So I'm more interested in the business case for Angular 2 and convincing companies that it's time to start making that change now rather than waiting. So there's a lot of great new stuff with Angular 2. The biggest one for me is the performance increase. I'm going to talk a little bit about React later and the issues that they solved with their platform, but Angular 2 has resolved a lot of the performance issues that they've had. There's a lot of speed enhancements. If you choose to go the TypeScript route, which I highly recommend, it's also much quicker in terms of coding and gives you a lot more backwards compatibility with other browsers. The tooling is fantastic with TypeScript. I don't know how many people, how many people use TypeScript in here? So probably half. That's pretty good. So you guys are all forward thinking. I appreciate that. The fact that you're here means that you are probably of above average intellect and better than all your peers. So I feel like I have a bunch of friends I can talk to. I know one of the key selling points, one of my friends with React was isomorphic. It could run on the server-side render prior to getting to the browser. Angular 2 now brings that in as well. The animation library has dramatically improved, and so you can do a lot more interactions, cool, fun things with the users, all with that Angular framework. So this is just kind of a quick rundown. One other platform. Has anyone here used NativeScript? Yes, good. Now I feel like I'm in charge again. So NativeScript is a way that you can take Angular applications, convert it more natively into code for applications on iOS, Android, and Windows Mobile. It's better than PhoneGap in that it actually takes a look at what your code's doing and helps perform that conversion rather than just creating a wrapper. All right, so there's a few steps in the migration path. If you look at the Angular guide, they have a pretty exhaustive tutorial on how to do it, and we'll go to that link in a couple minutes to walk through the basics of it. One of the big things that is going to make your life so much simpler is if you're using the Angular 1 style guide. Please tell me you're all using it, because it really makes life easier for any coder who's coming in to look at your stuff. And then the use of a module loader. So this is going to be your System.js, your Webpack. We're probably all used to using Grunt and Gulp and some of these older build tools, but you really need a module loader to be able to leverage the goodness of TypeScript and moving forward with Angular 2. With Angular 2, they created an upgrade adapter, which does a whole lot of magic. I know in the coding world, magic is always makes us happy, makes us feel like we have a lot of control. But it is actually a really phenomenal tool that will allow you to take Angular 2 components and inject them into Angular 1 directives or services, and the same thing with 1 back to 2. And so it was built with the idea of, hey, we're going to be able to make these two work interchangeably because of all the uproar that happened when they said, hey, we're not going to support Angular 1, Angular 2 is going to be kind of the thing moving forward. And then once you have an Angular application bootstrapped with 1 and 2, you just start converting the components and the service is over. And it's actually really, really easy if you use the style guide for Angular 1, just a little bit in terms of decorators and whatnot. So let's hop over to the upgrade guide really quick. How many of you have worked with Angular 2? Okay, 10%-ish. How many of you have tried to do an upgrade of an application from 1 to 2? I see one hand. All right, still in charge here. This is good. So they have a phenomenal guide here, and what I talked about briefly was some of these things. I'm having scroll problems. I apologize. So they kind of broke it down into 2 different areas of importance, and they'll walk you through it. This PhoneCat upgrade. When I worked on doing the PhoneCat upgrade, it took me about an hour and a half to get from the original PhoneCat app to an Angular 2 complete version of it. And it's not big. I mean, you're talking 7 or 8 files that you're updating in total. So I'm sure all of our code bases are a lot bigger than that, but it is a phenomenal way to walk through it. But again, just to reiterate, you really need to use the style guide, a module loader. How many people here use Webpack? Good. How many people here don't use any module loader at all? Use grunt gulp, just, okay. Or both. I guess both works too. So, and then the migration to TypeScript. So the migration to TypeScript, I'm going to touch on that really quick. TypeScript makes use of just standard JavaScript, and so you can actually just change extensions from JS to TS, and everything will run just fine, no problems at all. So the change from JavaScript to TypeScript is very, very low impact, and quite honestly, it doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot for you by just changing the extension and having it compile. But the benefit is the second you convert all your extensions over to TypeScript, to the TS, you compile them, you can now start to add type checking. TypeScript has lots of tools for handling null values and various other things. So if you're not using TypeScript, I highly recommend it because it allows you to use the latest and greatest standards, ES6, 2016, all that, and it'll transpile it back for what you need. The upgrade adapter, as you can see, has a whole lot to it. Let me jump into the good stuff. You don't care how it works, but when it comes to bootstrapping both, you basically have to include your original script for your Angular 1 app, and then you also use your module loader to load in your Angular 2 app. And so you actually have the standard way of loading it, which we're all used to, just throwing the script tag in there, and then you're using your module loader to pull in Angular 2, and then that will bootstrap, and they work side by side, and you can inject things back and forth. It's fairly simple. So I walked through the tutorial. And when it comes to dealing with Angular 1 and 2, naming conventions become very, very important because you can very quickly mess up your code base by not knowing which one is which. So in their instructions, they actually directed me to change the file path or the file name to .ng1.js, just so that you can remember, okay, this is an Angular 1 thing, and then moving forward, you can have all Angular 2 items just be the standard item. We doing okay? Yeah. Okay. So I ran a quick script that would run through and just go ahead and change all the file extensions. Chris, you're always bringing up good points, and I hate it. Let's see. You good?
Yeah.
Can the people in the back see it? Ish. Okay. Okay, so we keep the original Angular module definition. So this is the original PhoneCat app. And then we renamed that to 1.ts, and then you generate your new Angular 2 app, which you can see using TypeScript and all the import stuff. It's if you're used to Java, this is going to make a whole heck of a lot more sense to you. So I know where I'm at right now at the moment, the Java engineers are pretty thrilled because it's going to make for an easier transition in learning JavaScript. But yeah, it's you've got your imports, you create the whole new app, and then you can start, just to show you them together. Now it's too big to scroll. Okay, so we're using system.js. So system here is importing the app, which is the Angular 2 item. And then we have also included in the script section the original one. And so because we're using a loader, it pulls in that, all its dependencies, and runs the Angular 2 app. And because we're running this, it pulls in the Angular 1 app. And so the two work just side by side with each other. To get them to work with
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
So if you're running them both side by side, does it affect performance?
I'm glad you asked.
What was the question?
So if you're running them side by side, how does that impact the performance? So there's a little bit of overhead with Angular 2, and there's a little bit of overhead with Angular 1, but ultimately you're still getting the same data back. And because Angular 2 is a little bit more optimized in terms of memory, and it decreases a lot of the extra features that they had thrown into Angular 1, you actually see some performance improvements in terms of memory management and whatnot. So like one of the key changes that they removed, it would be the filter and the order by clauses. You now have to implement those yourself in Angular 2, but at the same time, it cleaned up some of the code from Angular 1, and so the actual package is a little bit smaller and has less to do. So let me pull up wow, I'm not used to it being this big. Let's see. Where'd my browser go? Not that
I
one.
have a question.
Yes.
Is it when you converted, a couple of the files from 7.5 to 6 files
Mhm.
from Angular 1 to Angular 2? It took about almost 1 or 2 hours.
Yeah, it took me about an hour and a half to run through it.
You rewrite it. Just wanted to know.
Sorry, what was that question?
So the question was, the conversion I said takes about an hour and a half to do, so between 1 and 2 hours. How long would it take to rewrite the whole app from scratch, basically?
With 7 files.
Right. How good of a coder are you? So the problem.
We're using your benchmark, so it's how good of a coder are you?
Okay, so disclaimer, I did not rewrite the whole app from scratch. And as much as I would like to believe it, my code is not flawless the first time through, and so I typically do have to debug just a hair, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, a couple things, some typing being off. So the problem with writing it from scratch is there's going to be the debug cycle that you're going to run into with each and every component that you don't necessarily get with just the conversion. Because with the conversion, you're modifying a couple little things. You're adding a decorator, and so you're not having to go through and recheck all your core functionality. There are a few places where that you have to rewrite stuff anyway. Like I said, filter is gone, order by is gone. So you're going to have to re-implement those functions by yourself, and you're going to have to debug those anyway. So I would say, I don't know, it's probably going to take you twice as long to rewrite it and test it and compile. Yeah.
The other factor is that you started from code that was conforming to English style guidance.
Yeah.
So that equation gets a little awkward also if you don't conform to style guidance.
Yeah.
Then you need to conform to style guidance so you can sort through the converter to get the end result. And so what does a converter do to your code if you don't conform to style guidance? Does it sort of hands and give up, or does it do its best, or what happens? Does it fail? Does it give you bad results?
No, it's more for the cleanliness. If it's a fully functional component that has everything injected properly, it'll still work. It's going to be a lot more confusing. Yes.
With the converter from Angular 1 to 2, is there a minimum safe version? So like 2 of the projects I'm working on, one is Angular 1.5.8, one of the newer ones, and then one is Angular 1.3 something.
So they recommend that you're using components instead of, I mean, you can use directives, obviously, but they're recommended that you use components. So Angular 1.5 or later would be the most ideal thing. I've actually got a slide that talks about whether it's better to just rewrite it or it's better to try the conversion. So,
Cool.
AJ,
yes, sir.
can you repeat questions that are asked up front?
Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you.
Did you want me to repeat those questions really quick?
Yeah. What were they?
Okay. Is there a minimum required version of Angular 1 to use the migration tool? The answer is I don't necessarily know, but I know they recommend you use components, which were released with Angular 1.5. So if you are 1.5 or later, you're probably safe. And the other one was if you are not conforming to the style guide, how much more complicated does it make a conversion over to Angular 2? And the answer to that one is if it's fully functional code, generally speaking, you can get it to work. It might be a little bit messy and you may have to debug a couple little things, but you can make your life a lot easier by conforming to that style guide. Any other questions thus far? Okay. So that was just showing you the basics of the code that I had to change, loading them both in. I really highly encourage all of you try the demo before you actually try to do a full-blown switch yourselves, because there's a lot of stuff that you learn through the process. One of the things that I learned was read all the text in between the code blocks, not just the code blocks, because they tell you to move some files around and do some other things. And actually, as part of the demo, they request that you pull in some stuff from the Angular 2 intro application. So if you miss out on that stuff, totally not going to work. All right. So on to the questions that I was answering. Is it better to start from scratch or is it better to convert? Again, if it applies, if you are using Angular 1 style guide, you're in pretty good shape. I think just in general as a coder, if you're using the Angular 1 style guide, you're doing it right. If you're not, please repent of your ways and make everyone else's lives easier by conforming. If you are using 1.5 or later, it's probably gonna make life easier on you, especially if you are using components. The big question though is how many lines of code do you actually have? If you have a massive monolithic app, it's going to take longer to rewrite from scratch than I think it is to start converting components one at a time, because you are rewriting core functionality over and over again. Do you have a question?
More a comment. I agree with that. But if you have a massive monolithic app, it's probably best to use refactoring anyway or restructuring.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a benefit in taking your first look at it. I mean, that still might be a bad idea to write it from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
But likely to do a better job. The end result will be better than if you just scratch your transform.
I will agree. For me, you're almost always, for a clean code perspective, and having optimized services, you're always better off rewriting because you know what it's supposed to be now as opposed to what it was supposed to be when you first wrote it. And that's what we're kind of trying to figure out is when is the best use case for trying to do a conversion? When is the best use case for rewriting the whole thing? And then are you using a module loader, and how much is it going to take to convince your boss that it is time to make the switch? So that last one is always the hardest I've found. Because whenever you start the conversation of, hey, we want to completely rework our entire code base, there are some people who roll their eyes and some people who get their pitchforks, and ultimately it ends up going absolutely nowhere. So if you're faced with this faced with this issue of not being able to get your boss to agree to a switch, I've got some stuff to help you out. First, I'm going to talk about TypeScript. This is totally out of order, and I apologize. TypeScript is in the wrong place here because I already talked about it. It's great, enforces type checking, works with JavaScript files. Try it. If you don't love it, I'm sorry. I love it. It's a great system, and it really does help your workflow. It allows you to use the latest and greatest code. All right, so business values. This is what you talk to your boss about, or managers, or whoever you need to convince. So and again, this is my take on it. If I were approaching a company and consulting them and saying, hey, look, you guys need to switch to Angular 2, these would be the points that I would bring up. We need to use TypeScript. With that, it helps decrease the errors that we're going to run into because you have better handling of nulls and undefines. You're not going to run into issues where you're passing the wrong type of thing in unless you're really smart and decide to let every variable have any value in it. Please don't do that. It's bad practice. With TypeScript, because you're using the latest standards, you're writing classes, you're using decorators, it actually does speed up the workflow. You're not having to be quite as verbose as you had to be with ES5. So ES6 is great. The experience is way better. So React solved a massive problem with the speed issues in Angular, and that had to do with the two-way render and a two-way binding. And fortunately, with Angular 2, they've solved all of those issues. So Angular 2 is now a magic bullet that can solve all of your problems. Please believe me. Or at least I hope your managers believe you when you say that. And then the animation framework is pretty solid. It makes use of the latest standards in terms of request animation frame and whatnot to provide very smooth animations. It's quick to learn. If you're a Java engineer, this is going to be very quick for you to learn. I think anyone who's used to a more conventional coding background, JavaScript has in the past been a little bit icky. You didn't want to touch it because it does all sorts of weird things and is not all that strict. With TypeScript, it kind of brings best practices in coding to front-end engineers who so desperately need it. So that's a great way to convince your bosses, hey guys, we're going to have cleaner code because the new system we're using is going to make us have cleaner code. It's quick to learn, and then because of the migration path from 1 to 2, being able to run them both side by side, you don't have to tell them, hey, we're going to stop all work for a year while we convert everything over to Angular 2, and then finally we can start to do new features. It's something where you can roll out new features in Angular 2 side by side with the old Angular 1 app, and it works seamlessly together. So I feel very strongly if you go into any meeting with these talking points, you can convince just about anybody, but that's just my opinion. So which is when to start? Do we start now? Do we start a year from now? I mean, they did say that until the majority of people have moved over to Angular 2, they're not going to drop support for Angular 1. So does it really make sense to make the switch right after they just released Angular 2? And I would argue absolutely yes. But you need to bear in mind that it will change in the future, and you need to start small. I wouldn't try to take on the project of doing a full conversion all at once. Because again, you're going to run into the issues of, well, we have to stop development for a month while we do the full conversion, or 2 months, or however long it takes, because these things always explode to be bigger than you think they're going to be. But I would recommend, if you have somebody's ear and they want to give you some time, tell them, look, this is the future. This is what we need to do moving forward with our app. And we need the performance enhancements. We need all that stuff we just talked about. So let's get started. Let me convert stuff to TypeScript. Let me add a module loader, and let me show you it can work side by side. So when talking about that, again, these are my estimates. So take them with a grain of salt. But as far as converting to Webpack, I mean, it can be as simple as an hour. If you have complex build processes going on with Grunt or Gulp or whatever, it can take several weeks to get everything loaded into Webpack to have it fully replace those. Or you can just use the two side by side and realize that nobody's using Grunt anymore and your life is sad and move on with things. TypeScript, the actual conversion to TypeScript is very quick. You just rename all the files. But that, again, doesn't provide you any value. What really provides you the value is when you start adding types to all of your variables that are being passed in. So that's why I say 1 to 2 days. You should be able to go back through your code pretty quickly and say, hey, this function, I know exactly that this pulls in an array. And so you can define that, and then moving forward, you will get any errors anytime it sees any problem with that. So there's going to be a little debugging because it'll make you realize how sloppy your code actually was. In terms of what you have allowed to go into the code, but it will dramatically clean up your code as well as the way you think about the code. And then you need to add the upgrade adapter. I put 1 to 2 days in there. I don't think it's that long, but you do have to make sure that that you are downgrading services or upgrading services depending on which version you're coming from and going to. And then for each component, as a rough estimate, I'd say you're probably looking at a day per component or service. This includes testing, because I know you all test all of your components and services every single time you write them. But those need to be upgraded when you make these switches over. So you've got to upgrade the tests, you got to test all the functionality, you have to make sure that it works in both Angular 1 and 2. And so I feel like 1 day is a pretty fair estimate as far as what it's going to take to convert each component over. So if you're, 1,000 component system, you might want to have a few engineers working on that, or do it as needed. One at a time as you're working on new feature sets, you can start that migration slowly. Again, these are my timelines, and I'm not always the most realistic person. I'm very optimistic about what things are going to take and how quick I can get them done. So they may be completely off. So please, no suing, no calling, emailing. But yeah, I appreciate recognition, but I really do not like criticism. So please hold that. So if you choose to wait, like I said, after the Angular team has already said that they will stop support for Angular 1 after the majority of the community has moved over to Angular 2. And I know because all of you are here, you're all very forward-thinking people who want to embrace Angular 2 and make it a part of your life. But there are some serious drawbacks if you choose not to go that route. And these are kind of in order of importance there. But I would recommend making the switch, or at least taking the time to learn it. It's a very useful skill, and you'll find yourself becoming obsolete if you don't start making the switch now. So React. Bryce, you asked about React. So I know there's all sorts of opinions on React, and I'm a very strong Angular advocate. This came from when I was working at a company called Master Control, and we had a battle royale over whether we should go with Angular or React. I'm sure you can guess which side I ended up on. But ultimately, they ended up going with Angular because I won, and I saw the issue, right? I mean, anyone who's dealt with a large number of records and with rendering issues associated with Angular knows that React beats the pants off Angular any day when it comes to dealing with lots of stuff with their virtual DOM. With the performance improvements in Angular 2, if you've looked at the benchmarks, they are basically on par with each other. So then the question becomes, do I forego all the beautiful functionality that Angular 2 provides so that I can rewrite an entire framework to do exactly what they're doing already? Or do I just embrace Angular 2, all its goodness, and work within one framework rather than creating a Frankenstein of multiples? So, unbiased opinion, Angular 2 is better. Did that answer your question, Bryce? Yes.
How well does the migration handle third-party support? So several third-party Angular components, directives,
Right.
modules, whatever. How well does that go into the version? What was the question?
Thanks for reminding me. The question was, how well does the conversion utility support third-party apps? For instance, if you're running Angular Bootstrap on Angular 1 and you want to use those in Angular 2, is that possible, or how difficult is it? The answer to that question is a resounding I don't know. Okay, I've only done the conversion utility on my own written classes. With those, I would just say, look, you're running Angular 1 and you're running Angular 2. Let them work in the environment they were built in, and then hope that they'll come out with a version for the new environment you're working in. But just thinking about the problem makes me not want to touch it, because it seems like a big, nasty issue delving into other people's code. Yes, sir.
How does Angular 2 support for internationalization, I-18N?
Phenomenal. Yeah. They've got a really good library. I don't know if you're familiar with Angular 1 localization libraries, but that was one of the earliest things that they added, because so many people use these in full web apps that need to be internationalized. So yeah, they've got great support for it. They also have phenomenal support for accessibility, and if you make use of the server-side rendering, you can get all that done before it even hits the browser. So, yes?
Is the same in Angular 2, they are changing? Because as I remember a couple of months ago, they're changing a little bit. Did they reach to the final version?
Yeah, so they hit the final version about a month and a half ago.
I think it was October 6th.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it's fairly recent. I've been using Angular 2 for about a year and a half on various projects, and so they've changed the framework considerably in that time. And I don't want to say you screw yourself over when you're using a beta version of something, but now that it is stable, they know what they're doing. You shouldn't run into too many fundamental changes, at least not for a while. So anyway, TypeScript is phenomenal because it really helps you with your types and whatnot. So I feel like I gave a pretty basic overview of what it would take to get you to move over to Angular 2. Benefits, yes, sir.
So back when I was messing with Angular 2, they had the ES5 and the FM5 and Nectar 6 shim files created for legacy support.
Mhm.
So they can improve the legacy support. So if you have some people using your software that are still on Windows XP and
Right.
IE8, this works.
Yes.
And, okay.
They have.
So can you explain what experience for people on old versions of OS X, or iOS, or older most phones? How?
So they transpile all the way back to ES3 now. which yeah, is phenomenal. It supports IE8. Let's see, I thought I had something in here about. Okay, so yeah, it'll transpile back to ES3, which is IE8, Firefox 3, Chrome 5, and Safari 4. Keeping that in mind, though, creating shims every single time you create a shim, it adds load to the processor. So yes, they will have the same exact experience in terms of functionality, but no, it will not be fast or pleasant. And if they're using IE8, you just kind of have to expect that your experience on the web is probably not going to be ideal. But yeah, the application will fully function if you use TypeScript and you transpile back to ES3. Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts on unit testing between Angular 1 and Angular 2? Like your experience with it, is it much different?
I mean, you're still using Karma either way. You're still writing, very similar tests. So I wouldn't say anything's harder than what you're doing now. No, you're still dealing with the same framework of either Karma or Protractor. There are some subtle differences, but for the most part, you're going to be working in the same exact environment from a testing framework, which is really beneficial given the fact that you would expect that any component getting the same inputs and giving out the same outputs would be able to work with any testing framework. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How large is the current Angular 2 ecosystem? How quickly is it growing?
Glad you asked. Let's see if I even have that up. I don't. So if you haven't used Google Trends, this is what I always use to prove that one technology is better than another. So we'll throw Angular up there, and just to prove my point about React, let's go ahead and throw React up there. Okay, so I mean, they're both on an upward trend, but clearly Angular has the benefit. I found this interesting. Apparently in the last week of the year, when nobody's working, no one does searches for Angular. So when you look at Angular 2, you can see it's that yellow line. It's really starting to take off. And with the growth of that ecosystem and then everyone being excited about it, I would imagine that the ecosystem itself is going to grow dramatically here over the next 6 months. That was one of the big problems I had with moving over to Angular about 1.5 years ago, is every single time I ran into a problem, there was nothing on Stack Overflow. I had no code to copy. So I had to dig in and figure out stuff for myself. But it's gotten so much better. The tutorial that they have, the guide that they have on the Angular 2 site is really good. John Papa is working directly with the Angular team to make sure that all the style guide is all in one place and everything's good. So yeah, the community support is growing very quickly. And I would encourage all of you to jump in and become community experts yourself to help out other people. Yeah.
Say to put in a plug for Pluralsight, they have some of the best Angular 2 courses. So that's your first source.
Awesome. So I haven't used Pluralsight myself, but I hear it's a phenomenal company and a great platform. But yeah, he brought up that they have some of the best Angular 2 tutorials on Pluralsight. So give it a shot if you've got a license. If you don't have a license, try to get one, I guess. Any other questions? Great. Well, I hope I convinced all of you to make the switch over to Angular 2. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to email me. I'm sure they'll post some information about me somewhere online, or you can just find me online. Everything's on the internet. So I'm making more points.